2009, he founded the No to Compulsory Military Service movement and declared his conscientious objection to service. He was arrested for his refusal to serve, but was released the next day. He was an active participant in the Egyptian Revolution. After, he was arrested and sentenced to 3 years in prison on charges of insulting the military through an article that he had written. He was pardoned by the military in 2012. He describes himself as a liberal and pacifist and has called for more peaceful relations between Egypt and Israel on multiple occasions. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you, Christine. Well, first I would like to thank Jean and the K Spiritual Center for hosting this event and for inviting me. And thanks for all of you for coming here today. And thanks for Christine for the effort she made to make this event happen. I wanted to speak today about the struggle for freedom in Egypt. Egypt is a famous country for its ancient civilization. It's an old country, 5,200 years. The first Egyptian state, central state, was established. The ancient Egyptian state was a dictatorship. It was ruled by one person, the pharaoh, who was equal to gods. He was a god. He was worshipped as a god. And we had our own monarchy or dictatorship for 3,000 years, basically from 3,200 years BC until sometime when the Persians invaded Egypt first time, then Alexander the Great came, and this was the first time, or this was the time when the Egyptian rule ended to our country. And since the Persians came to Egypt, Egypt was occupied or colonized for 26 centuries or 25 centuries by foreign countries. First by Persians, then the Greeks, then the Romans, then the Arabs, then the Kurds, then the Turks, then the French, then the British. And after nearly 30 centuries of national dictatorship, Egypt was exposed to foreign dictators or colonizations. So basically, in our history in Egypt, for thousands of years, we didn't experience democracy. The ruler is considered as a god, and he rules as a god. He decides who live, who die, who owns, and who doesn't own. Pyramids were tombs for pharaohs. Temples, ancient Egyptian temples, were just memorials to write the achievements of pharaohs and sometimes their propaganda. In 1919, nearly a century ago, a huge liberal democratic revolution happened in Egypt, and it had two demands. First, independence from the British occupation or colonization, and second demand, a democratic constitution. And this revolution, because it was peaceful enough and because it appealed to the world, it succeeded, and in 1922, Egypt gained its independence from UK, and in 1923, Egypt had its first democratic constitution, and we started for our first time in our history to have a liberal democracy in Egypt. This democracy lasted for around 30 years, in which, through free elections, Egyptians voted for liberal democratic parties, and most Egyptians enjoyed huge amount of freedoms which they have never enjoyed for thousands of years before. But this democracy wasn't successful to last for a long time. For 30 years, it was successful enough. Egypt was a free country in the Middle East. People came from different countries to enjoy its freedom. During the Second World War, Egypt was more democratic than every European country except UK. Egypt was more democratic than France, than Germany, than Italy, than Greece, than Spain. And lots of European refugees came to Egypt during the Second World War to enjoy shelter and safety and freedom in Egypt. In 1952, our military decided that there's too much corruption in our political regime, and they decided to fix things themselves. So they abolished the democracy, they abolished the constitutional monarchy, and installed a military rule. And sooner they aligned themselves with the Soviet Union, they adopted a one-party system. Tens of thousands of political prisoners were taken to prison. Some of them were tortured, some of them were killed, and Egypt started its more evil and oppressive rule, which lasted for over than 60 years, and it lasts till today. The same military dictatorship. In 2003, after the invasion of Iraq, before that, Egypt remained an ally and a friend to the Soviet Union for a long time until in the end of the 70s, Egypt signed its peace treaty with Israel, and this was the moment which Egypt moved to the other side and became an ally to the United States. And since that moment, Egypt receives a huge amount of military and financial aid from the US government. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, lots of regimes which was affiliated with the Soviet Union collapsed, but Egypt didn't, the regime in Egypt didn't collapse because at that time Egypt had moved already to the other side and became aligned to the United States. In 2003, when the United States decided to intervene in several countries to remove threats or promote democracy, lots of regimes in the Middle East decided that they need to pretend that they are more open and more democratic to avoid an international intervention. At the time, the Egyptian government did the same. They started to open a margin of freedom to pretend that Egypt is a democracy. So the Egyptian president Mubarak, the dictator who had been in power for 25 years already, in 2005 decided that Egypt will have its first free election. Before that, the president was elected by the parliament. And it was the first public election which people can run for the position of presidency. I and lots of people in my generation decided it's a moment we have a space to express our opinions. The risk of speaking out is less than before. So I became an activist. I was at the time student at the veterinary school in my home city, Asyut. I decided to become an activist. I joined several liberal political parties and several movements. At the time, I belonged at the time to the Coptic or the Christian minority in the country, and I was involved in the issues of religious freedoms and minority rights. In 2005, after the presidential election, Mubarak fabricated the results of the elections, and his opponents was put into jail, sentenced to jail for 5 years, and the curve started moving down again, and this frustration and depression, which led to afterwards to explosions, which led to the revolution afterward. In 2009, I realized that the main competitive advantage of the Egyptian government is their ties with Israel, and that the Egyptian regime uses the conflict with Israel to justify internal and local oppression and restrictions of public freedoms, and at the same time uses this as a tool to conscript hundreds of thousands and millions of Egyptian youth for free in the Egyptian military and use them to restrict democracy and oppress our people. So in 2009, I started a peace movement, and until now it's the only peace movement, grassroots peace movement in the country, and it basically was peace for everyone. Either it's Ethiopia, it's Sudan, it's either it is Israel or Iran or Turkey or United States or whoever. Locally, we counter conscription. We encourage people to refuse the military service. We advocate for adopting a professional army in Egypt and ending the conscription system and ending every side of militarization of society. We oppose the intervention of the Egyptian military into the economy or in military tribunals or in restricting people's rights to travel outside the country. And of course, we oppose the restriction of local freedoms, individual freedoms, under the excuse of national security or being in a conflict against other countries. In 2010, I was the first ever Egyptian to refuse the military service based on conscientious grounds. And at the time, the Egyptian military didn't know how to react to this. 3 weeks after, I was kidnapped by the military police from my house. And the next day, I was exempt from the military service on basis of being psychologically insane and unfit for the service. At the time, that was the third time I was arrested in Egypt. In total, I was detained 5 times in Egypt. When the revolution happened, it was a surprise for me and others. For years before, I've participated in several protests, but usually our protests were like 50 people protesting for whatever human rights cause and hundreds of policemen trying to stop our protest or at least contain it. But for my surprise, in 25th of January, thousands came to tens of thousands in the beginning, and the millions went to streets protesting for freedom and democracy. And I realized that the domino effect started from Tunisia. People were somehow jealous, saying if Tunisians can overthrow their dictators through nonviolent revolution, why can't we do the same? And actually, that's what happened. The Tunisian revolution triggered several revolutions in several countries, in Libya, in Yemen, in Bahrain, in Syria, and Egypt. in 18 days, we managed to lead into a situation which Mubarak had to resign or the military had to drop him of power. The military had an interest of getting rid of Mubarak because they didn't like his plans inheriting power to his son, and the military in Egypt has been preservative in the concept that civilians can rule the country. Since 1952, the concept of the regime in Egypt that only a military person can be the ruler of Egypt. The military assigned a military council who took over the country after Mubarak was dropped from power, and there was a huge status of euphoria about the military in my country. People hailed the army, people celebrated the army, considered the army as a hero. But on the ground, because I was working against conscription and working on issues related to the army 2 years before, I knew that the army isn't the one who will bring democracy or human rights to the country, and I knew about the several violations done by the army during the revolution. I was one of the victims of the army during the revolution because 1 week before Mubarak resigned, I was detained by the army and I was exposed to torture in the headquarters of the military intelligence in Egypt. So I knew that the army committed several human rights violations during the revolution, against the revolution, and that the army wasn't on our side. The army was trying to contain the revolution, and when they couldn't, they overthrew Mubarak and took over as a way of containing the revolution. So I wrote a huge research about the human rights violations done by the army during the revolution, and I documented every human rights violation I could reach. And at the time, this article created a huge shock in society. Over than 500,000 people read the article in its Arabic copy. And people started questioning themselves, questioning their support to the army. Is it right to support this army who committed these human rights violations? And is a group like the Egyptian army who commits these amount of human rights violations would bring democracy to the country? The army tried to silence me. I was detained for the fifth time. I was detained from my house by the military intelligence. This time I was accused of insulting the army in front of a military tribunal. So basically, they said every human rights violation I wrote about and I documented with pictures and videos, they said all of these are fabrications and are rumors, and I'm spreading these rumors to insult the army and damage its reputation. I had a very short trial. It was a secret trial. No public or media or international delegations were allowed to attend it. I didn't have the right to defend myself or to bring witnesses to say that these events I wrote about really happened. It wasn't fabrications. And in 12 days, I was sentenced to 3 years in jail, in prison. I don't want to go into detail, but I suffered a lot in prison. Sometimes I had to share small cells with common criminals, people who commit murder and rape. I witnessed torture of other prisoners for a long time, and for a long time at the beginning I was abandoned by most of local and international communities. Lots of people said or believed that it's still better to support the military instead of the country going into chaos, so they undermined lots of human rights issues, including the violation of my rights to fair trial and to freedom of expression. I was abandoned by several human rights activists in Egypt because of my atheist beliefs and because of my support to peaceful relations with Israel and support to the right of Israel to exist. So for the first 5 months of my detention, I received very little support from local and international actors. The White House made statements, the State Department made couple of statements. 2 congressmen also here from the United States supported my case from the first week and sent letters to the Egyptian government asking for my release, but that was limited actions with limited results. After this 5 months, I decided that I have to do something myself, so I started a hunger strike. And I didn't expect I would survive that long, but my hunger strike lasted for nearly 130 days until the last day of 2011. And because of this, my hunger strike, a huge international reaction happened, and several actors, international actors, joined the campaign, including Erwin Cotter, a Canadian parliamentarian, and he was the international attorney of Nelson Mandela. He joined the campaign. The European Parliament made several resolutions asking for my freedom. The UN Human Rights Council, they filed a report about my detention and calling it arbitrary detention. And because of this international pressure, the Egyptian military had to cancel the verdict against me and put me on trial again. But at that moment, I decided that I'm not going to accept to be tried in front of military courts. I demanded my right as a civilian to be tried in front of a civilian court, not a military one, and I decided to boycott my military trial. So the first day, I was in prison, and they sent a police vehicle to move me from the prison to the military court, and I refused to move from the prison. And I said these arguments: I'm a civilian. I refuse to be tried in front of military trial. I asked. Prior to that, I asked my lawyers also not to be present at the court. So the military judge felt insulted that I refused to appear inside his court and decided to punish me by sending me into a mental hospital. So the next week, I was transported into a mental hospital, and it was an exceptional event because I was the first activist made in the history of Egypt for the last 50 years to be transported into a mental facility as a punishment for his activism and expressing his freedom. In the mental hospital, I was lucky. The doctors there were very moral, and they refused to be used as a tool to punish political activists. So within 2 days, 48 hours, they filed a report saying that they don't have any medical or psychological reasons to be at their facility, and they asked the government to immediately remove me from the facility. Also, they were scared because I was on hunger strike for a long time then, and they were scared that I may die at their facility, and then the military accused them of killing me or consider them responsible for my death. But anyways, that embarrassed the Egyptian military, and to run out of this embarrassment, the Egyptian military offered me a deal that I can be released if I signed a letter saying that I apologize for what I wrote against the military. Sorry. And at the time, I decided to refuse this deal. First, because I believed that if I apologize, then I have wasted everything. I have paid all the price for nothing. I wrote my article. I stood against the military because I believe that my people deserve to live in freedom and human rights, and their human dignity needs to be respected. And my apology would destroy everything I built before. Second, and that's what I told them. I told them that I was exposed to torture. My freedom was restricted by them without justification. They should be the one apologizing to me. I shouldn't be the one apologizing when I just stated the facts about their crimes. Of course, that was offensive to the military, especially when this incident came to media, and then I was sentenced for the second time to jail for 2 years instead of the original verdict of 3 years. The international reaction for the second verdict was very high, and several protests happened in Egypt. Thousands of people joined asking for my freedom, and because of that, the military had to release me in January 2012 after 10 months of detention. After that, I decided to move to Germany for my master's study, and immediately after I left to Egypt, they filed 2 cases against me. The first case was in October 2012. They accused me of blasphemy because of expressing my atheist beliefs on Twitter. And on December 2012, I visited Israel and Palestine, a peace mission, met several peace activists and peace actors from both sides, and I was accused in Egypt with treason and Zionism because of that visit. So I got the message that the country is saying that if you come back, you'll be detained on location in the airport and you'll be put on trial for both crimes. Blasphemy in Egypt is a crime punishable by 5 years in jail, while treason can be punished by death sentence or life sentence, and sometimes a fine. And there are several incidents in the last year in which in which the Egyptian government took away citizenship of Egyptians because of expressing opinions against the government or opinions which favor Israel. So I lived the last couple of years in Germany trying to continue my activism from there, supporting different conscience objectors to the military service and defending several political prisoners. And I focus a lot on 2 areas. First area is people who are being detained or jailed under the blasphemy law. And the other area is people who are being detained because of being gay or transsexual. And a couple of months ago, I moved here to the United States, and I'm trying to continue my activism from here. And of course, during these times, the Egyptian government has been following me. Sometimes I notice that I'm being followed, or as activists say, I have a tail. And even today, I noticed that on Twitter, some pro-government actors speaking about this event and asking the Egyptian government to take away my citizenship because of what they consider an act of treason, speaking here again as the Egyptian conscription. My movement supports several people who refuse military service. The recent case of a conscientious objector my movement supports is the case of my brother, who refused military service nearly a year ago. And the government decided that they are not going to put him in jail because they don't want to make him famous, like what they did to me. So they decided to put him in a legal limbo. And because of that, he lives for a year now without his documents. He can't study, he can't travel, he can't work, he can't have a travel document. And basically, that's what every person who refuses military service in Egypt are exposed to. In the last couple of years, activists, I think at least we are speaking of 10,000 activists were killed by the Egyptian police and military forces in the last 4 years after the revolution started. At least we're speaking of 40,000 political prisoners in Egypt nowadays. The people in Egypt are being jailed under several laws, including the journalist. Part of the Egyptian Penal Code is called journalism crime. So there's around 15, 18 opinions in Egypt which are considered crimes. So criticizing the president, criticizing a foreign president, maybe Ahmadinejad or Bashar al-Assad, criticizing the judiciary, criticizing the parliament, blasphemy, of course, are considered crimes punishable by jail in Egypt. And these laws, the penal code exists in Egypt for like 8 years or something, but the amount of cases which the Egyptian government has been brought to courts after the revolution using these laws has exceeded a lot. Of course, the incidents against journalists, I'm sure lots of you heard of the case against Al Jazeera staff, but it's not only Al Jazeera staff. There are tens of journalists in Egypt who have been arrested from different news agencies after the last coup. Of course, there was a year which the military in Egypt had a deal with the Muslim Brothers and allowed them to rule the country, and which led to what some people consider another revolution in 2013. And maybe we'll discuss this during the discussion. Some people believe that the Muslim Brothers can be moderate actors and with time bring a democratic rule in Egypt and somewhere some system similar to the situation in Turkey. And I believe that among others and among the majority of Egypt, the Muslim Brothers has a project to install in a way the Islamic Caliphate, and first Egypt would disappear as a nation state, and second the Islamic Sharia laws, including some barbaric physical punishment, will be installed in Egypt with time. The year in which the Muslim Brothers, the two cases which were brought against me were brought during the Muslim Brothers rule. So basically, even the Muslim Brothers are out of rule. They are the ones who exiled me out of Egypt, not the military. And there is around 500 protesters who were killed during this 1 year the Muslim Brothers were in power, and they when the Muslim Brothers were in power, they excessively used the blasphemy law. So hundreds of people were accused of blasphemy, Christians or atheists being accused, and Shia Muslims were accused of blasphemy in the year the Muslim Brothers were in power, and some of them are international actors. So as an example, there was a verdict against YouTube and Google for was blasphemy because they claim that YouTube has an obligation to remove a movie which criticizes Islam. Even there was a case against the French president Nicolas Sarkozy, was blasphemy in Egypt because they considered him responsible for not banning Charlie Hebdo from being published in France and considered this an act of blasphemy. So everyone in Egypt who opposed the Muslim Brothers in power were terrorized by their cases, and there was hundreds of political prisoners. That's why I and others stood against them. But when the coup in 3 July 2013 happened, I again refused the military intervention in Egyptian politics. I believe that every time the military in Egypt intervene in politics or in economy, they mess things up, they destroy things, and they make things worse. My final point is that there is a huge debate in Egypt, and I think here in political circle, about the US aid to Egypt. Is it moral that the United States continue to support arms and funds to a coup government in Egypt, which is responsible for several massacres and is a continuous support of United States to dictatorships in Middle East, is it responsible for anti-Americanism attitudes among people in different countries, and does it help terrorist and jihadi groups to recruit more people and use them in action against the United States? I think these are questions which should be more discussed, and maybe that can be part of our discussion as well. I don't want to talk much, so I will leave the rest of the time to our discussions. Thank you for being quite nice.
Well, we'd like to open it up to questions. Carl?
I have a question. You say the blasphemy law has been in place for 8 years. I had always presumed that Egypt was a secular state, and I realized that the majority of the population are Muslim. But what were the circumstances in the country then that law, that actually has so much effect, that in the long term even more, was created? And was it used very often in the beginning, or the post, or from the revolution onwards? I'm just curious, the evolution of that law.
Well, most of the Egyptian legal system was installed after independence from UK. So when Egypt was under British occupation, we had British rules and British courts. Egypt got independent in 1922. In 1923, we had our first constitution, and it was a democratic constitution. Religion was mentioned once in this constitution, and nearly at the end of the constitution, it said that Islam is the religion of the state. But the state was secular. It was a constitutional monarchy, but we have to understand it was democratic and secular with the standards of 1923. So to compare it with other times, so as an example, women were not allowed to vote at the time. But at the time, women were not allowed to vote in most European countries as well, and maybe in the United States. So it was liberal democratic country with that standard. The Egyptian Penal Code was assigned afterwards and was copied. Most of its sections were copied from the French Penal Code. Most of the legal system in Egypt was copied actually at the time from the French legal system. In the first 30 years, blasphemy was considered a crime in most European countries and Middle East, but it wasn't used much. It was used several times and has been very critical. There is a case, the famous case against Taha Hussein, when he published his book about the Shari Jahili, about poetry, poems before Islam, and he was tried for blasphemy for that. So there were several incidents during the democracy of blasphemy, but during that time there is no jail sentence. It was scary, people were brought to courts, but no one was sentenced to jail. During the dictatorship, and Nasser pretended to be secular and to be socialist for a long time, so he didn't also use that law a lot. Mubarak remained in power for 30 years. During these 30 years, there was only 2 famous blasphemy cases, which resulted into jail. One of them was against Karim Amir, an Egyptian blogger. He was sentenced to 4 years in jail in 2006. Actually, in 2007, 3 years for blasphemy and 1 year for insulting President Mubarak at the time. And the other case was against an Islamic clergy, Abu Islam Ahmad, and he was sentenced for 1 year for insulting Christianity. During Mubarak time, well, as every legal system, to start a case, you have to prove that you are being harmed to start a case against someone, you have to prove that you are being harmed by someone. So during Mubarak, the right to start a blasphemy blasphemy case was restricted to religious institutions. So only Al-Azhar or church can start a blasphemy case against someone during Mubarak time. After Mubarak left power, the other authorities allowed anyone to start a blasphemy case. So basically, anyone can go to a court and start a blasphemy case against me, and courts will take it. And that was the shift which happened after the revolution, and which allowed everyone to start blasphemy case against everyone. But the law has been there, and the other journalism crimes in Egypt has been there since the beginning of the Egyptian constitution and the Egyptian democracy. And I think that's one of our mistakes as Egyptian Democrats, is that we didn't try our best to make our democracy perfect, and that led to some Trojan horses which destroyed our democracy with time. I think the Egyptian democracy, the major reason the Egyptian democracy collapsed in 1952 is the wrong decision to engage in 1948 war against Israel, which allowed the army to gain lots of power, and they used this power 4 years after in overthrowing the democracy. So I think there is a pattern in several countries. You can see it between the growth of the military and of the democracy is that the military, when they get too big, they get greedy and they seek power, and with time they can overthrow the democracy. Any more questions?
You mentioned your activism for gay and transgender people in Egypt. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the current state of for that community in Egypt.
Well, legally there is no law against being gay or lesbian or whatever, LGBT in general. But there is some laws which has no exact concrete meaning. So there is laws which forbid indecency or indecent acts and these kind of things. So these laws, it doesn't define what is an indecent act. So the Egyptian government sometimes uses these kind of inobvious laws to start cases against the homosexual community. And this law was used several times in the last decades, but it was very few times, and it usually brought scandals. So during Mubarak, there's one famous incident. It happened in 2001, I believe. It was called the Queen Pot case, and they brought around 20 people and accused them of being homosexual and put them in jail. Some of them were sentenced even for 15 years. But I think that one of the important things about these incidents, we have to understand not all of these people are really homosexuals. So they arrested some people from their houses and said we arrested them in a homosexual act and sent them to jail because of that. So sometimes these laws are being used against dissidents or political activists as a way to put them in jail. After the revolution, what happened is that the government started excessively using this law or these articles and putting lots of people against in jail. It increased again under the Muslim Brothers because they tried to be religious, to look religious, and they're the ones who protect Islam and protect public morality. But then when the coup happened against the Muslim Brothers, the Sisi government tries to say we are not less Islamic than the Muslim Brothers, so they started bringing more cases and using them as a tool for local propaganda to say that whatever they capture the biggest homosexual network in Cairo, the biggest prostitution network in whatever. So they are using this as a way for their propaganda to say we are not less religious than the Muslim Brothers, and they are actually arguing that the Muslim Brothers don't represent the true meaning of Islam. And so the conflict between the Muslim Brothers and the Egyptian military is being portrayed internationally as a conflict between seculars and religious groups, but actually it is a conflict between two religious groups who have two different concepts of Islam. I believe the Egyptian military share every principle which the Muslim Brothers believe in, except the belief in Islamic Caliphate. So the Muslim Brothers, Islamic Caliphate. So the Muslim Brothers believe that all Muslims internationally should be under one rule, and it would be one Islamic state. But the Egyptian military don't believe in that. They believe that it's their country, they have the right to rule this country forever, and they are not willing to leave the rule of this country to any caliph from any other country. But when it comes to women's rights, to gay rights, to minority rights, to position toward Israel, the opinions between the military and the Muslim Brothers are nearly identical. So I think nowadays we have at least 50 people being in jail under the articles or the accusation of being either homosexual or transgender. There has been no lesbians being arrested in Egypt, and it's hard. It's hard to work in these cases because there is no actual law in Egyptian legal framework against homosexuality, and that's usually the main defense which these people use in courts. And yeah, just one personal incident. Before I go to jail, I wrote several times again about gay rights. So when I was in jail, I was being put under special circumstances because they assumed that if I defended gay rights, then I'm gay myself. So as an example, I was put in solitary confinement for a long time because they assumed that I would engage in a homosexual act with other prisoners inside prison. So I was punished more than harsh criminals on different aspects for different reasons. Sometimes I was called an Israeli spy, sometimes I was called gay, and yeah, I wasn't. Yeah. Other question, please?
My question is, what do you say to the people that think that the military was the only way out of that spiraling down with the Muslim Brotherhood governing? As you know, most of the minorities, if not all the secularists, the left wing, the liberals, the moderate Muslims, which constitute most of the Egyptian people, really were against the Muslim Brotherhood. And as you know, in that year, there was such a spiraling of this government into really a disaster. So how do you answer that the military, a lot of people think that it was the only way out of where we were going through with the Muslim Brotherhood?
I would say that the military is the only way toward an Islamic radical rule. And I would explain that. When Egypt was a liberal democracy, Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, ran to parliamentary membership twice, and he was voted out twice. He wasn't elected, he didn't succeed to get votes in his hometown, in his main town in Ismailia, which at the time was the main quarter of the Muslim Brotherhood. So in liberal democracy in Egypt, not a single Muslim Brotherhood member was even elected to government or parliament in free and multiple elections. But the first time the Muslim Brotherhood take a governmental position was by the military during Nasser rule, and that's when the conflict happened between Nasser and the Muslim Brothers, because they were not happy of having small portion of the government and they wanted more, and that's when they started to have a conflict with Nasser. But the first time ever in the history of Egypt, the Muslim Brothers obtained a ministerial position was by the military, not by through democracy, liberal democracy. And the dictatorship in Egypt, first they increased the size of religious education and through Al-Azhar and building Al-Azhar schools all over Egypt, and that actually which created the high level of fundamentalism in Egypt till today. Egypt during the democracy wasn't that much fundamentalist, and the number of people who were extremists were far less, because radical education and religious education was far less at that time. So as an example, my hometown in South Egypt, Asyut, Asyut had the first ever university in modern Egypt. It was built by American missionaries, Christian missionaries in the 1800s. When Nasser took power, the American university was nationalized. The government took it, and it became Asyut University afterwards. And then Nasser built a new Azhar University in my hometown. So instead of having an international university which promoted free education, it was replaced by one propaganda state university and one religious university. The number of, I think when Nasser took power, there was like around 12 Al-Azhar high school in Egypt. Now we have over than 30,000 of them. So the military is the one who made the Azhar and religious institutions part of the state and gave them rules and increased attention on religious education, which leads to more fundamentalism. And actually nowadays the military is doing the same by restricting public freedoms, by exiling human rights activists and civil activists like myself and other liberals. The only opposition existing on the ground are the Muslim Brothers, because the only place they can close are mosques and churches. And that has been, you can compare this to the GDR in Germany, when political life were abandoned, people were only active in churches. It's the same thing. If there's no political parties and there's no civil society in Egypt, the only place which people can meet are mosques. So actually by restricting the civil society, the state empowers religious institutions and makes them more strong. And nowadays the military is leading to more collapse, first by intervening in the economy. So speaking of the Egyptian economy, more than 50% of the Egyptian economy is controlled by the military. And people are working in these institutions. I mean, like every part of the economy, gas stations, food factories, water factories, ports, highways, building stadiums, infrastructure, everything in Egypt is made by military companies. And these military companies pay no taxes, and they have no workers, mainly because they use recruits as free labor. So what kind of economy can survive without taxes and without workers or employment, and these employees paying taxes to the state? There is no economy is going to survive in this way. Without free market economy, without entrepreneurship, without investments, the economy in Egypt are not going to survive. And you can see this pattern since the the overthrow of Mubarak, the Egyptian currency has lost nearly 25 of its value, the international debt has increased, and the economy is collapsing. People are which investor would go to invest in a country in which the government arrests people just for speaking out and creates terrorism by being so much oppressive and using violence against civilians? Which investor will go to invest in a country which has curfews most of the time? So actually the military by its actions first is making the political spectrum free for Islamists by excluding and exiling everyone who is a liberal Democrat or is a moderate or non-violent. And second, by intervening in the economy, they are destroying the economy, and this collapse will lead to more power to whatever insurgent groups. And you can see this in the region. Only military dictatorships in the region are the countries who suffered after that from radical Islamization. So monarchies like Jordan or Morocco, they don't have strong Islamist groups. But military dictatorships like Libya, like Egypt, like Syria, like Iraq, are the countries which have high radical Islamization. Radicalization in the region is a reaction to military dictatorships. People nowadays they think that ISIS is cruel, but ISIS is just a reaction to Assad's cruelty and the brutality of Assad. When Assad regime at least used chemical weapons 15 times against civilians, I mean, what we expect, do we expect that there will be no reaction to Assad crimes? ISIS is appropriate reaction to that, and ISIS started in Syria, not in Iraq. It came to Iraq afterward, or the Islamic State. So every action will lead to a reaction, and supporting a military dictatorship, the strongest military dictatorship, the strongest will be the reaction to it, and the reaction at the moment will be in Islamic fundamentalist groups, because every other option is being excluded or massacred by these military guys who, I'm sad to say, most of the world supports. Okay, you?
So in early 2011, when the Arab Spring launched, I mean, we saw tremendous citizen engagement and civil society participation in the streets. People were coming together in amazing numbers as well as ways, and I think they could see the power of citizens speaking out collectively, and eventually with the conflict of Mubarak. But I'm wondering, what were the lessons learned from that? Where are the citizens now? Are the citizens uniting together to speak out against the stuff you've had to go through and many others have had to go through? What were those lessons of speaking up collectively? What's happening now?
Well, what happened is a huge frustration in the country for not being able to install a democracy. Of course, we have, as Egyptian Democrats, we have lots of internal problems. One of our major problems, we never had the chance to organize ourselves because there is no freedom of assembly or association in the country. So all our organizations, including my organization, myself, are small groups. Collectively, we can act together to overthrow a government when you put thousands of groups, small movements together, but none of us is able to handle, to be in power or to reach power. Imagine, I mean, in the United States you have strong parties, at least two strong parties. They are organized. Some of them has been for 100 years or maybe more. But in Egypt, I mean, I belonged in my career, in my life, to 4 different parties. None of them exist anymore. The first party, I was in the first party. I joined. The government took its leader and put him in jail for 5 years, and the party collapsed afterwards. Then I joined another party, and the government closed it by a court decision. Then I joined another party, and they didn't give him a license. Then I joined the fourth party, and it had to merge in another party afterwards. So first, we are unable to organize ourselves, and that's one of our internal difficulties. Lots of countries try to support us by training or by finance to be able to strengthen our organizations. Then the government crashes that through the famous NGO trial in 2011, in which lots of international civil workers were detained in Egypt and put into trial. And then that's one of the difficulties. The second difficulty which comes to that is that the international support for the Egyptian dictatorship hasn't ceased. So even we are trying our best, there is an endless supply of arms and funds going to the Egyptian military all the time. And when the Egyptian military commits massacres, from 2011 till today, the international reaction is nearly nothing. And its maximum is just some condemnations through statements with no reaction at all. So somehow we are overwhelmed by the military power of the military, and in Egypt, we made our decision, I think, that we don't want to engage in a violent reaction to the government. In Syria, I believe because the brutality of the regime was very harsh, people had to react and defend themselves with violence. In Egypt, the mainstream still refused to use violence against the government forces, so we ended up without option. We don't have the options of using non-violence anymore because public streets even stopped, there's curfew, and people are being detained with hundreds of, tens of thousands of people being detained, and we refuse to use the violent option. There's other local or internal problems. One of our problems is the education system in Egypt is very bad, and there's no free media in Egypt, and that leads that the propaganda of the regime really works. And Egypt has at least 5 secret services, and they have endless financial support, and they have hundreds of thousands of people working for them, so they are able to put informats inside every organization and destroy organizations from inside or divert their agenda. And of course the issue of Israel-Palestine is being excessively used all the time to divert the attention of organizations and create internal conflict between organizations. So I understand there is internal challenges we need to address. We need to lots of people are calling that we need enlightenment before a revolution. We need people to know what is democracy and what is freedom and what's the difference between democracy and fascism. And the democracy is not that 51% or 51% decide to do whatever they want to the minority, but the minority rights should be protected and freedom of expression should be to everyone. So we need our enlightenment and our education role locally, but also the international society has to understand first, its moral duty to supporting a democracy in Egypt, and second, the international society has to understand that if the Egyptian dictatorship continue to exist and the liberal alternative doesn't exist, this dictatorship will fall one day and the consequences will be severe on the international society. We saw how the situation in Syria led to millions of refugees and several terrorist organizations. Egypt is 4 times the size of Syria. The collapse of the regime in Egypt will lead to consequences 4 times the size of Syria, or maybe more. There will be millions of people on European shores asking for refugee, and that will have implications in Europe. The situation in Europe is not that safe with fascist groups and the segregations towards the minorities. So the consequences of the collapse of the military in Egypt will be severe on the international system, and the world has to realize that if the civil alternative doesn't exist in Egypt, we will have to suffer a lot when the system collapses, and it will collapse. Salami, Joel, do you want to say something?
I was just going to, well, just say very quickly that the United States policy right now adopted, and I shouldn't said this, but the Obama administration, by its decision in the State Department not to characterize what took place as a military coup, is a direct violation of statutory law, and has, I think, had a lot of unforeseen and foreseen negative consequences. So this administration's policy is right now in violation of I don't know how you can characterize what took place in Egypt if it's not a coup d'etat. So I think one of the things, I mean, we're sitting around this table, one of the things we can do, frankly, is we can write this administration, whether it's the White House or John Kerry, the Department of State, or the, I'm not sure who the Assistant Secretary, but I think we can relay very forcefully our displeasure with the fact that this administration will call on it to obey the law. That's what I would say, and characterize what took place in Egypt as a coup, which that triggers a lot of things, which includes the suspension of military assistance, which we're giving in huge quantities to Egypt. And we can go about 10 more minutes, and then we're gonna which is our custom. Anybody? Okay.
Maikel, thank you for your struggle against the military. I appreciate that. You did a lot. I have some comment only. The military really destroyed Egypt since 52. Some positive thing happened during the beginning of Nasser, but after that, we arrived to the standard of living we have right now, which is disaster. Egypt used to be one of the top countries, as you said, in the 40s and early 50s, and they struggled until the 60s, and then start to collapse as we see. Military take over during Mubarak. They have an agreement, and we see it now. They never protected the revolution. They came with a plan, and they've been in control until today. They never lost control. Morsi never had a control. But the election of Morsi was really democratic. Many people went out in the street and voted honestly, and there was a split, as you saw, 51 to 49, or 50, 49 to 51, something like that, which is very close, and I call that democracy in the best way we can found. I don't think Muslim Brotherhood was rolled with religion at all. I don't remember any law passed saying we have this law about religion at all during their period. But the media and the military want them out, and they did what they do. And they killed thousands right now. Right now we have an agreement with the liberal Muslim Brotherhood and other group how we can pass this period. We have an agreement. Muslim Brotherhood agree in a democratic, civil society, democratic country, and without military, without religion, without anything. We have that, and we'll like to discuss that with you later on. But what we have now is a disaster. Military is killing people. They create terrorists in Egypt. These people who do terrorists in Sinai belong to the thugs of the Interior Ministry and the military, and it's disaster right now. What happened to regular Egyptian people, and maybe the revenge will be worse, and we might get a bad situation in the future if we don't survive right now. That's my opinion only on that.
Well, that was a comment more than a question, but
Let's get a couple questions.
Okay.
Because
Yeah.
we-
Actually addressed the question
Huh?
that I had previously. Okay.
Well, I really had a comment. I appreciate your informative presentation, but I think that there's nuance that may be missing in assuming that there's a certain uniformity among the Muslim Brotherhood in their opinions. And that affects the question of how the relationship between the Muslim Brotherhood and the military during the period of democratic rule. In particular, as you may recall, although the election certainly was the fairest and freest in recent Egyptian history, nonetheless, some candidates put forward by the Muslim Brotherhood were not allowed to run. And my main observation about Morsi is his incompetence. And I've always believed that the military, if they had to have a Muslim Brotherhood candidate in the running, preferred one who was incompetent. First, because I think they expected to win the election. I think they were very surprised when they didn't. But in any case, it made a great backup plan because Morsi was so incompetent that I think that what happened later was inevitable.
Question in the back.
Yes. Could I just ask, you said that the judge sent you to a mental institution. I was wondering if that was overtly punitive on his part?
Sorry?
Or did he do that? Did he justify that by saying he was punishing you, like you said he did it as a punishment? Or was there another justification that he gave for doing that? Also want to know what kind of legal recourse there could be for anyone who's a conscientious objector. And then I also wanted to ask about what the U.S. involvement was in during the time when the Muslim Brotherhood was in power, and what effects directly that the U.S. had on that, and whether that was good or bad.
I would address these 3 points. Okay. I would comment here 2 comments. First, I don't believe that the election, which led to the election of the Muslim Brothers, was fair or free. And to argue that, we have to establish what is free and fair. So one of the aspects that people can't vote twice. Everyone has to vote only once, and everyone should have access to vote. We have two cases in front of the Egyptian administrative courts claiming of around 13 million people listed in the vote records who doesn't exist. 13 million voters or potential voters out of 45. So in Egypt, there's 45 million people can vote. 13 millions of them, they can't exist. They don't exist. They either repeated name or fake names. And these two cases in front of the administrative court has not been decided on till today. So in Egypt we have a theater play, very famous one called شاهد ما شافش حاجة, or a witness who haven't witnessed anything. And the theater play is about someone who's being a witness in a court case while he hasn't been a witness to the case or the crime itself. So I find it awful for people to say election in country X is fair while they haven't been an observer or witnessed the election in such country. In the election of 2012, Egypt refused every single international observer to observe the Egyptian election. There was no international observation. They allowed only the John Carter Center to observe the election. Carter Center sent 17 observers. Only 2 of them were arrested the day of the election and being accused of being spies. And 17 observers cannot observe election in Egypt, which happens in 30,000 ballot office. So first to say that any election, country X, is fair, first someone has to observe this election and say it's fair, and this place has to be credible to believe its result. And considering the case that we have 13 million names in the voting lists who doesn't exist, and knowing that the police and the military are in control of issuing IDs and making these lists, and we don't trust the Egyptian police or military, then the whole assumption about fairness of election should be questioned. I'm not saying maybe at the time the majority of people supported the Muslim Brothers, maybe not, but I'm saying to say that an election is fair, we at least need an international observation committee to observe the election and say that the election was fair.
I think you misunderstood me.
I'm making a comment.
I said I was not disputing the fairness of the election, although I did not think it was fair. Because, forget about the Carter Center, which I'd like to know why they certified that it was a fair election if what you say happened. Forget that. I said it wasn't fair because certain candidates who should have been allowed to run were not allowed to run. So it was definitely not a fair election.
That's another reason, the time of the electoral campaign. So candidates were allowed only to have a campaign for 1 month only. And that wasn't enough for the campaigns in a country of 90 million people. 1 month is not.
So I was right.
I agree with that. I say that you can argue it was the most fair election Egypt had in the last decades. You can say that, but I don't say it's democratic or fair enough. The second point about the Muslim Brothers not ruling by religion and not introducing religious rules, I don't think that's true, because the Muslim Brothers introduced a constitution in the beginning of during the years they ruled, and they introduced a new article in the constitution applying the individual decisions, ahkam al-sharia al-islamiyya, or the individual rules of sharia law as part of the constitution. And this article wasn't in the constitution before that. And so the Egyptian constitution now, okay, in the democracy, Egypt, the constitution said Islam is the rule of the religion of the state. Then in the 70s, Egypt introduced another part of the article, and it became Sharia law as the main source of legislation. And because of this new added piece, every law in Egypt introduced in the Egyptian legal framework has to comply with Sharia law. Then when the Muslim Brothers were in power, they didn't make only the general concept of Sharia law is part of the constitution, but they made every judgment and rule of Sharia law to be part of the constitution. And that was a shift forward in making things religious. They also introduced a new article saying that freedom of religion is only for followers of what they call Adyan Samawiyya, or only the 3 Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. And this part of the constitution is still remain in the constitution, which the new constitution which El-Sisi brought to power afterwards. So they introduced religious rules, and I wouldn't say the democratic. Morsi remained in power for 1 year and didn't make the parliamentary election. So the recent system in Egypt is the president holds the executive power, but if the parliament doesn't exist, then the president also holds the legislative power. And Morsi delayed the parliamentary election for 1 whole year to be able to enjoy the legislative power at the same time. And I wouldn't claim that's democratic. During Morsi, who was in power, there was, except him, Morsi, there was not another single Egyptian official who was elected. No, none of the cabinet was elected. There were no parliaments. There is no local parliaments or mahalliyat in Egypt. So Morsi ruled for 1 year, and he was the only one elected in the country. And there was a case already against him in court saying that he didn't win the election. So I wouldn't call that as democratic. Of course, they were not brutal as the military who came afterwards, El-Sisi, but that doesn't mean that they were Democrats. And yeah, just for time constriction.
We're gonna have to, our custom is, so we should wrap this up about 1:50.
Yeah, that's the last question. The legal ground for sending me to a mental hospital was checking if I'm sane enough to stand trial. So the argument made by they send me, the court sent me to the mental hospital to be examined if I am mentally sane enough to stand trial. And for them it has different advantage. First, it would give them the possibility to release me if they wanted, on the grounds that I'm not sane to stand trial. And if they decided that I wouldn't be able to run in any election in Egypt because I was decided by court before that I'm insane, and it would, if that happened also, that would discredit me politically, so people will not take my opinion seriously because of that. So the legal grounds were that to be checked if I'm mentally sane enough to stand trial, and of course the grounds for which was my hunger strike. I was on hunger strike at the time, or before 2 months or something, and the argument that anyone who's sane who wouldn't start hunger strike killing himself, and they use this argument. You asked another question which I don't remember.
Yeah, the legal recourses for the conscientious objectors.
In Egypt, there is no recognition of the right of conscience objector. So the obligatory service is 3 years mandatory on every male, and there is no recognition of the right of conscience objector. We try to encourage and advocate for recognition of the right of conscience objection in Egypt, but the Egyptian military is very harsh on their stance. They don't want to recognize that.
Listen, I think I speak for all of us in saying that we are honored by your
My
presence.
honor.
We are honored by your presence. Your courage is something that moves us very much. I feel very conflicted because the United States government is deeply involved in this. And we have an obligation to our own government in the way our government uses our taxpayers' money. And in this instance, I think we are not living up to our own kind of creed, if you will, our own values, our own principles. And this is a very powerful witness that I feel privileged to have been able to listen to and to learn this story. So we are very grateful to you for the valiant way and the courageous way that you have held to your principles and sought to be a change agent in your own country, and so we're very grateful for this, for having this privilege of listening to you. I'm grateful to you all for coming. I'm sure that Maikel will be more than willing to stay here for a few minutes and speak with you. As we indicated, it is being recorded. It will be put on iTunes, right? Through our website. And so, Christine, do you have any?
Thank you for
John.
coming, and thank you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.